Hi everyone, my name is Jason Van Tol and I'm a PhD candidate at Southern Cross University. This is a talk that I gave just last weekend at the University of Queensland's postgraduate conference, and I thought I would record it to share it more widely, and indeed, if you like it, please share it with your friends and networks. So in this talk, basically, I focus on one specific development of my thesis since my confirmation of candidature. And before I get started, I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm on Bundjalung country and that this is stolen Aboriginal land. Sovereignty was never ceded. And that this is just one of many examples supporting Proudhon's famous aphorism that property is theft. Okay, so one of my two research questions is, how do young people understand and respond to the perceived tension between education for employment and citizenship education? Okay, but why should there be any tension between these two roles, employees and citizens, and education's preparation for them? Why should there be any tension between them at all? Well, there's no time to make an elaborate argument. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to contrast two high-ranking and official definitions of each. So the first one comes from the Australian Government Fair Work Ombudsman, which defines an employee as one who, quote, performs work under the direction and control of their employer on an ongoing basis. Okay. The second one comes from Australia's National Educational Policy, which for 3 decades referred not just to citizens, but active and informed citizens. And most recently, this has been rebranded as active and informed members of the community, but which has retained this following characteristic nonetheless. These are people who, quote, work for the common good, in particular sustaining and improving natural and social environments. Okay, so if you just look at these, the two descriptions of these two roles, I contend that these are two radically different conceptions of work, and that education and preparation for one tends to occur at the expense of the other. Yeah, what I'm going to argue for here is a kind of compromise to soften the tension between these two roles in education for them. And I'm going to do that by first arguing that over the last, say, roughly 45 years, which is the neoliberal period, that education for employment has become increasingly prominent. But how do we know that, and why should that be the case? I'll address the second question first. So this is a graph of the labor underutilization of young Australians, those between the ages of 15 and 24. And labor underutilization is the unemployment rate plus the underemployment rate added together. And this is really the relevant metric. The underemployed are those who want work, who have work and want more but cannot find it. And so this is really the relevant metric because when the ABS sends out its workforce survey, the question it asks is, have you been employed for 1 hour in the last week? And if you answer yes, then you're considered employed. Well, that's not very useful because most of us can't survive on 1 hour's wages a week. We need to work more than that. So as I say, this is really the relevant metric. It's the unemployment plus the underemployment rate added together. And as you can see by looking at the graph over time, young Australians have become increasingly underutilized. This graph goes back all the way to 1978, which is very close to the beginning of the neoliberal period, and I'll come back to that shortly. And so this appears to provide a rationale for bending the purpose of education towards employment and preparation for employment. But the problem is that this leaves unscrutinized the nature of unemployment. And I'll come back to this as well. But for now, I want to consider what effect this labor underutilization has had on young people's education. To address this, I'm going to compare the Carmel reports. So for those of you who might not know, the Carmel reports were the first significant attempt by the Australian Commonwealth government to intervene in schools um, with a coordinated set of goals and priorities, etc. So there were two national reports, and conveniently, one each was published during these two periods, which you can see on the screen, and I'll say something briefly about them. So it's important to understand that every Western country, including Australia, pursued successfully a full employment policy from the end of World War II until the onset of neoliberalism, which varied a little bit from country to country, but in Australia began in 1975, right at the end of the Whitlam era. That was the first time that Australia's unemployment rate rose above 2%, and it has never dipped below that since. So the first Carmel report was published in 1973, tucked inside the full employment era. And each of the Carmel reports had a section in them on what it considered to be the purpose of education. So this first report, published in 1973, said on the purpose of education that, quote, schools can build within themselves a community where both education and people are valued, and where the influences of the marketplace do not dictate the price placed upon individual talents. Okay, and I just want to flag something before I compare this to the next report, which many of you are probably already aware, but I just want to highlight, is that the full employment period was a time of significant social progress. This included the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and of course the radical student movements, which reached their peak in 1968 with the worldwide student uprisings. Okay, so that was the purpose of education and the social milieu under full employment. Now let's contrast that with the next Carmel report, published in 1985, when neoliberalism was well underway, as we saw, and was characterized by, amongst other things, rising un- and underemployment. And now on the purpose of education, Carmel said that the Australian government wished for, quote, an improved relationship between secondary education and employment and tertiary education opportunities and requirements. And it went on to say, I'm quoting, that it does not believe that the sole purpose of education is to fashion the young to the needs of the labor market, nor does it believe that this is the government's intention. But it went on to say, excuse me, still quoting, employment immediately after schooling or after further study is an expectation for the great majority of people. And finally, to reaffirm the subordination that students as future employees were meant to incur, it stated that, quoting once more, that one set of skills required in this role, meaning as an employee, is that which involves selecting behavior which is appropriate in the workplace, when and how to accept authority, how to comply with directions, and how to learn what is expected in different situations tend to be learned by experience and demonstrated in everyday life. Work experience programs and increasing employment of secondary students as part-time workers offer the prospect of spreading understanding of labor market expectations among young people well before they seek to become full-time members of it, unquote. Okay, so the whole tenor of the Carmel reports shifted under neoliberalism, with the latter of them infused with economic so-called rationality and concepts and jargon. And to the best of my knowledge, this was the beginning of outcomes-based education, which we're all so familiar with by now. So the purpose of school under neoliberalism has, as I've tried to argue, has increasingly become about labor market preparation. And hey, why shouldn't it? The labor market underutilization has been on the rise, as we saw on the graph. So what's the problem here? Where's the tension? Okay, so the tension arises out of one of the core insights of modern monetary theory, or MMT for short. If you just Google MMT, you're going to get a bazillion hits, but I'm just going to focus on one of its central insights that bears on what I'm talking about here. So MMT describes the political choices that are available to any government that meets what's called the sovereign currency criteria, which most governments in the world, including the Australian government, now meet. Basically, the sovereign currency criteria is that the government issues its own currency and that it has a floating exchange rate. So MMT demonstrates that governments that meet this sovereign currency criteria face no nominal constraints on spending. They do face real constraints based upon the availability of resources, but a sovereign currency issuing government can always afford to buy anything for sale in its own currency, including, importantly, labor. So, in other words, unemployment is a political choice, not an economic necessity. And I'll say this again because it's really crucial. So long as a government can issue its own currency and it has a floating exchange rate, it has no nominal constraints on spending, and it can always afford to buy anything for sale in its own currency, including labor. So unemployment is a political choice, not an economic necessity. If the government wanted to, it could hire all the unemployed tomorrow. Yet according to neoliberal theory, unemployment is considered normal or natural, and therefore, according to neoliberal dogma, education should be increasingly aimed at preparation for employment, as if unemployment is an educational problem rather than a political economic one. So to reiterate once more, MMT demonstrates that this is false and that unemployment is a political choice. It's not an economic necessity. Okay, now, because most MMT people support a job guarantee and a return to full employment, I'd like to end on a thought experiment, and I'd like to invite you to consider this with me. So imagine what education would look like if upon completion, every graduate at whatever level were guaranteed a job democratically created at a living wage and doing meaningful work. Something to think about. And so I'm going to end by imagining what some of the consequences of this might be. So I would suggest that full employment policy would help to diminish the tension that I described at the beginning between education for employment and citizenship education. And it would be a major factor in improving social environments, just as Australia's national educational policy goal requires, where working people don't need to compete for scarce jobs in the labor market, just as they do in a game of musical chairs. So, to put it bluntly, under neoliberalism, labor underutilization is being used as a weapon against working people and students to force them to compete against one another. And education has been drawn in to service this goal. But remember, though, this is a political choice. It can be otherwise. So, if full employment were achieved again, just as it was following World War II until the onset of neoliberalism, this would, I think it's reasonable to suggest, liberate education from the narrow goal of conferring employability skills, and thereby contribute to the achievement of Australia's overarching policy goal that I mentioned before. It would help all young Australians become active and informed citizens who work for the common good, in particular sustaining and improving natural and social environments. By improving these social environments through full employment, it would or could thereby potentiate the sustainability of natural ones. Okay, thanks for listening, everyone. These are my references. If you like this talk, please share it with your friends and network. And if you want to get in contact with me, my website and email address is on the first slide. Thanks for listening.